All right, so this is what I'm calling the Garden of Forking Paths, which is a system for knowing trees. This system applies specifically, and the way we're going to learn the trees, we're going to focus on Eastern North America, but this system could apply in other places as well. So it's not just specifically. Yeah, Garden of Forking Paths. So first we have to think about dichotomous thinking. So that's what you want to do when you're doing any kind of keying. If you're working with macroinvertebrates, if you're working with plants, herbaceous plants or trees. And when I say keying, is just what I mean is just finding the identity of that plant based on the specimen. So it's dichotomous. That's a division between two things that are opposed or different. So here's this fork, yes or no. That's a dichotomy. Red or blue would be a dichotomy. Greater than 6 feet tall or less than 6 feet tall. And most keys will be asking you questions like this. So, oh, I've got this beetle under the microscope, and I want to find out whether it's this type of beetle or that type of beetle. And I need to look, and the question is, the elytra are, 6 millimeters or 10 millimeters or whatever. So this is like dichotomous thinking, and the forks in the road are what you have to work from. So you have to choose that. And if you're going to learn trees following the Garden of Forking Paths method, which I'm teaching you, you need to try to get your brain to think about forks in the road. If you don't do that, you can just learn the trees. Some people who've been around before in the field and such, like internships or whatnot, someone might have been like, oh, come here, I'm going to teach you this plant. And they just teach you the name of some plant. That's great. That's good. I'm not opposed to that. But it's a somewhat useless skill, because then if you leave that and go somewhere else in some other plant and it's not the plant you learned, well, you're lost. So learning plants' names, which is all I'll do in the field, is one thing. Also learning how a system to connect them all together and to have your thinking be precise. Those two things work in combination make someone good at taxonomy. Taxonomy is just the naming of organisms. So I'm going to teach you a system of knowing trees that relies upon this kind of thinking, dichotomous thinking, forks in the road, the Garden of Forking Paths. Learning the system is more important than learning the names of individual tree names, although you will be quizzed based on their identities. Because if you learn the system, then you can apply it to trees that you have never learned. I'm also going to introduce you to the idea of using a formal dichotomous key. That's like so for example, in the state of Ohio, this woman named Lucy Braun wrote this book that's got every woody plant in it in the entire state, thousands of plants, and it's all part of one big key where there's forks and forks and forks and forks, starting from scratch and going all the way down to species names. So I'm going to introduce you to that. We can't do it in this class. It's just too much to ask of students, but we will do a little bit of I'll try to make it such that we can work with actual keys some too. So the combination of some kind of system to get you started and the ability to use a formalized key to finalize your identification is the way of learning any kind of organism, insects, mammals, etc. Thus, even if you're not really into trees on this call, if you're like in this class, you're just like, trees are boring to me. That's okay. Learning the process will help you work with other groups too. So we have this big fork. Is it a tree, or yes or no? If it's no, then like for example, if it's a turtle, this is not going to help at all. So this is not good for if it's a turtle or if it's a bird, or if it's an herbaceous plant. And with that distinction, we'll get a little bit complicated. So we'll see that next week, where it's like, oh, it's only 12, it's only this tall. Is that a herb or is it a woody plant? That is to say, is it a tree seedling or not? So although this distinction can be a little bit tricky. We probably won't do quiz trees that are seedlings, although it's not impossible. Okay, so here is the Garden of Forking Paths, page 1. There's 2 pages, and this is page 2. And the point of this is there's forks and forks and forks and forks. in this path. So the first fork at the very top is it a coniferous tree at tilde? Does it have scales or needles? Or is it a deciduous tree, as to say, broadleaf? And these are not perfect distinctions, but this is a good place to start your tree knowledge. And then there's forks and forks and forks. So, okay, you head down this path, broadleaf, then you're going to fork between opposite versus alternate leaves. And if you go alternate, you got to go across the page. If it's opposite, then you fork between simple and compound. If it's simple, then you fork between egg-shaped or lobed. If it's lobed, you fork between toothed or smooth margins. So this is the basic system. If it's you don't know these words yet, but I'm going to have a separate lecture that's all these words. So I'm just like trying to unpack it for you. And what I really want to happen in this class is for your brain to start doing this automatically. Because what I'm trying to say is if your brain does this and it's like forced into this, then you'll have a way of knowing plants if you end up in Serbia or you end up in Arizona or some other place. The same way of thinking about it. Broadleaf, opposite versus alternate. First question, if it's a broadleaf tree. If your brain does that automatically, then you've got a system you're working in. If you're just like, what tree is that? I don't know. I've never been to Serbia before. Okay, you're lost. If you fork on this side, we're looking at it, it's got scales or needles. If there are scales or awns, then you're in juniper. If it's needles, then you got groups of needles or single needles. Are they flat? Are they angled? And this is a simpler set of criteria or simpler set of forks. So let's work it just a very little bit. Okay, start at the top. We have a fork on this side. Is it scales or needles? And here's some just examples, just to get your brain to start to work. And this is what we're going to do next week, basically. Walk around, and I'm going to try to get you to start like, needle leaf trees look like what? Here's an example. Here's another example. Here's another example. Here's another example. Now, this one would be in the sort of scales category. Scales are awns. So these are different forms of going down this fork. On the other side, on the broadleaf side, you can have things like this, or things like this. And so your first fork is, which way am I headed? And this is super easy. You'll know this instantly. And I'm going to start the class with giving you things that are super easy. Like this is an obvious distinction. Okay, is it needle leaves or is it broadleaf? And if you head down this path, in the garden of forking paths, you have to choose one path or another. So you're going to have to make a decision at the start. Or am I heading down this way, broadleaf, or I'm heading down this way, needle leaves? Step one. Once you've made that fork, then that's where you're going. Everything else falls out of it. Every other plant in the flora, all 2,746 or whatever that would be down the other side, are out. If you're working with woody plants, there's way less than that, 200 or something total. But anyway, all the other species are out. Now you're just on this side. And that's one of the beautiful things about this system is once you've made that selection, everything else disappears. So you don't have to worry about those things now. You're just making the distinctions within that group. Once you make a choice, the species in the other path are eliminated, and that becomes the road not taken. I encourage you to read this poem by Robert Frost. It'll be a great one for next week. Okay. So let's head down this side. Now I've eliminated. Let's say that we came up to a tree and we're like, okay, this is definitely a needle-leaved. We'll just call it conifer. They're not all, doesn't always work, but we'll just call it needle-leaved or conifer. And we've eliminated everything else. So now we have to make our first choice. The first fork is it scales or awns or is it needles? Now the good news is this is the end of the path. If you fork here and fork there, you're in juniper, what I'm calling juniper. Juniper has its own distinctions, and you're not done. You don't have the species name yet. That's the other part of it. I'm going to be in the field teaching you species, but the system can get you to that space. You're like, okay, this is some kind of juniper. Junipers look like that. This is an example. And this is awns. This is an awn. That's like, it can poke you. It's actually an anti-herbivore leaf structure. Like, it's specifically there. So for mammals, if you like whack the back of your hand against it, it's like burns for like 25 minutes. That's not what I should do. And this would be a needle leaves over on this side. This is actually spruce. So we'll introduce you to those in the field. Needle leaves can come in different forms too, though. This is a sort of a waxy, sharp needle that's single. This is a soft needle that comes out in groups called fascicle. These are all words I'm going to teach you. It's quite soft and fragrant, actually. So on this side of this fork, we've got these scales and these awns, and I'm calling it juniper. On this side, we've got needles, and that's going to fork. It's going to fork multiple times. But here's the fork in the road, the garden of forking paths. If you say, okay, I've got a plant that looks like this, I'm in juniper, and I'm going down that pathway. That's the garden of forking paths. And if you choose to go down this side, and this is just awns, for example, you're like, well, this is in juniper, you're done. That's it. You just went, and then you rely on either a key, it would be like a taxonomic key, or your personal knowledge of the species to be able to go, okay, this is Juniperus virginiana. Okay, Virginia juniper. I've got it. And I've got the actual species name. And then I know something about its ecology. And then from its ecology, I can know something about the landscape I'm in. Aha, must be an old field, for example. The soils are this kind of soils. I mean, if you know the trees, then you can know the history of the landscape to some extent, actually. And also you can know what's going on in the soil, actually. And you can know something about the disturbance history, too. So you can learn a lot about what's going on around you. We won't have the opportunity. If we had the class, I could take you in a van and go somewhere, then we could really get into that piece of it. Like, okay, look around, look at these trees in this site. What happened here? What's the story? And you can start to unfold the history of the site in your mind based on the ecology of the tree species that are standing there. But if you don't know the tree species, then you're blind to all of that. You don't know what's going on. You're confused. So a big part of this in the next lecture, that one I'm going to record for also for this coming week, is going to be on botanical blindness and the solution to that. Okay, so in the Garden of Forking Paths, once we've reached an endpoint, we've eliminated many potential identities for the specimen, but we have not arrived at the final positive species name. Finalizing a species level identification will take a process, working with a field guide or formal taxonomic key, or your personal knowledge. And that's the end of my lecture. So I'll stop this now, stop the recording.